you'd look at their crops, you'd talk about road development or a dam or whatever. You kept in close touch with the people, and incidentally, you would speak to them in their own language. It was terribly important to learn the local language as quickly as possible.
The British mainly took indirect control by appointing local leaders to manage the colonial mission. But ruling by proxy created huge variations in practice and fostered enmity between tribes. And ultimately, African leaders working for the British lacked credibility in the eyes of the people.
When the white administrator in his Bentley or in Rolls Royce with a Union Jack appears, there is no question. There are no two sources of authority. There is only one authority. It is the authority of the king or the queen.
One man at the Conference of Berlin walked away with his own private colony and showed what colonialism looked like at its very worst. King Leopold II of Belgium had originally founded a committee to civilize Africa, convincing the Berlin delegates that he merited a territory 2.3 million square meters in size, the Congo Free State. But instead of improving the Congo, his 23-year reign was so brutal that the population halved, while Leopold and his men amassed huge personal fortunes. Men, women and children were forced to collect huge quotas of rubber for export. Those considered work-shy could face a punishment of hand amputation or worse. Dunlop's invention of the pneumatic tire in 1888 increased the price of rubber, the profits of Leopold, and the misery inflicted by his men.
When you look at Congo under King Leopold, you realise the whole imperial venture in Africa could have been a great deal worse. I mean, that was just pure looting. And Africans who didn't allow themselves to be enslaved were just killed.
By 1903, reports of atrocities compiled by Christian missionaries and British envoys reached the world press. Leopold was exposed, but it took another 5 years for the Belgian government to finally repossess the Congo from Leopold amidst a state cover-up.
The British, the French, the Germans, before 1918, of course, the Belgians used taxation, they used forced labor for their enterprises, it was the same practice almost ever. From the point of view of the African, there was a unity in the colonial system.
The imposition of European rule was at best a bittersweet encounter. In many places, rapid development came at the expense of personal freedoms. Development designed to help the European project as much as to help African society.
Roads were built, planned by the Europeans, the French or the British or the Belgians, does not matter. Roads were built, schools were built, with a taxation imposed upon the people. Colonization is always a system of high planning, but the planning is not done democratically. The planning is imposed by the masters.
All the infrastructure that they built, the railways and the roads, were travelling from mines or plantations to the port. It was about sucking Africa's wealth out of it. And you can contrast that with India, say, where actually the railways and roads linked up towns. India was linked up internally. But in Africa, it was about getting the resources out.
The scramble for Africa may have delayed conflict in Europe, but it couldn't prevent it. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 called on Africans to make the ultimate sacrifice for their mother country, even if they had never set foot on its soil. At least 165,000 Africans are thought to have died in the fighting. And in the Second World War, France and Britain's dependency on African troops peaked at around 500,000 men. The plunder of Africa's human resources had caught up with the plunder of the earth.
Younger people of my generation were drafted to go to Vietnam. They fought in France against the Nazis, against the Germans. They fought in Algeria, in Tunisia. against the liberation movement there. No, there was no choice but to do it. Tens of thousands, indeed, of Africans of all confessions, Christians, non-Christians, Muslims, Arabs and blacks, who made that force.
For de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, their show of loyalty would not go unrecognized.
After World War II, there were reforms in the colonial system. The French began to introduce in the Constitution of 1945 and 1946 the idea of extension of citizenship to all people, regardless of his or her level of education. The British began to appoint Africans to the assemblies in their respective colonies and so on.
But it was too late to buy loyalty to the empire. War had released a powerful genie from a bottle: African nationalism.
World War II was a turning point in terms of the relationship between all the colonized people of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Because World War II destroyed systematically the invincibility of the Europeans.
They suddenly found that these white people who back home in Nigeria, they had sometimes deified, they basically lived completely unequal existences. And suddenly they found in places like Burma that they were just as human as anyone else. They were brave, they were cowards, they did everything any human being did. And when they went back to Africa, my father's generation, quite a few of them became really politicized and took part in the struggle that ultimately culminated in independence.
Africans were about to get a global platform for their struggle. With the war's end in 1945, the world powers pledged never again in the form of the United Nations. The new UN Charter explicitly promised self-sovereignty with a committee dedicated to hear the grievances of colonized peoples. Throughout the 1930s, an economic depression had loomed over Europe, and the running costs of colonial administrations had soared since the start of the war. At the same time, Europe's economic crisis devalued the prices of Africa's raw goods. War-torn economies now buckled under the burden of running colonies overseas. The driver of colonialism once again became a catalyst for change: money.
Britain was bankrupt after the Second World War, and it simply couldn't afford to go on running them. My grandfather was then working in the Gold Coast, and he was sending rice and ground nuts back to his 4 sons in Britain. And they write pathetically grateful letters. Thank you for sending us this food. And I think the irony of that is amazing. Africa feeding very hungry Britain.
But even as late as the 1950s, many in Europe allowed themselves to believe the empire could endure.
The visit of the Great White Queen that touched the Nigerian imagination.
Instead, the colonial powers were about to discover that exposing their subjects to world events had planted the seeds of their own rapid downfall.
The European, being in the position of power, had one yardstick. He didn't use anybody else's yardstick. His yardstick was the yardstick. But what has happened, and most Europeans don't realize it, time has changed.
With this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer, to struggle, to sacrifice, and even to die if necessary in order to be free.
And as the people in Africa and Asia get some power of their own, they get a mind of their own. The European yardstick now isn't necessarily the yardstick.
The Negro came to feel that he was somebody.
Race had emerged as the touchstone of the post-war world. By the 1950s, Colonial rule had produced an elite of African nationalist intellectuals, and behind them, large, urbanized and literate working classes. Together, they witnessed the power of nationalism. In Egypt, where Gamal Abdel Nasser expelled the British, and in Algeria, where the resistance stood firm in its war of liberation from France. At the same time, the presence of the United Nations, the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States, and the nascent anti-apartheid movement focused the lens of world scrutiny on black rights and spurred on colonized Africans in their call for self-sovereignty.
I'm happy to state that in accordance with your wishes, arrangements are now in progress to turn Ghana into a republic.
Ghana is free.
In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan state to be granted independence by transfer of power to Kwame Nkrumah, widely considered the father of African nationalism.
He was impressed by the United States. He was a student here. The Americans did something extraordinary. He said, the 13 colonies, instead of each one becoming independent, they came together, created a union. Power is in the union. That is where Nkrumah explained the American dream and American realization and so on. So he dreamed for something like that in Africa.
Nkrumah had inspired others with his vision of a United States of Africa. Men like Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Felix Hubert Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. Men who had received colonial education. With the idea of empire increasingly unpalatable to the voting public, European governments had little choice but to work with the nationalists.
There was an indifference at this stage towards the empire, towards the colonies, and I found that really rather depressing. You'd start trying to talk about it in a pub and people say, oh, shut up, have another drink or something. There was just this idea that colonialism is wrong and needs to be got rid of.
The pressure for wholesale decolonization had been building ever since the end of the Second World War. The tipping point came on Wednesday the 3rd of February, 1960.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact.
British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a warning shot to the whites of apartheid South Africa and a death blow to the colonial venture across the continent.
That signalled, to my mind, the idea that Britain disapproved and the world disapproved of apartheid and the racism of apartheid. But it didn't necessarily mean that we were giving up on our role in Africa. I didn't think so.
In fact, within 10 months of the Wind of Change speech, Britain had surrendered 2 key African territories, France 14. The rate of decolonization when it arrived was breathtaking. Many were